In May of 1951, for the first time in American history, organized crime appeared on television. The Kefauver Committee, formerly the Special Committee to Investigate Crime in Interstate Commerce, chaired by Senator S. Kefauver of Tennessee, had been traveling the country for nearly a year, holding hearings in 14 cities, interviewing over 600 witnesses, and assembling a portrait of the American underworld that most citizens had previously encountered only in newspaper headlines and Hollywood films. Now it came into their living rooms, not as abstraction, not as fiction, as testimony. Real men, real questions, real answers, or the careful absence of real answers, which was itself a kind of answer. The hearings were broadcast live in New York, and the audience response was extraordinary. Stores closed. Movie theaters emptied. Housewives postponed errands. Department stores set up television sets in their windows so that people on the sidewalk could watch. An estimated 30 million Americans watched the New York hearings, a number that exceeded the audience for most major sporting events of the era. They watched mobsters sweat under the lights. They watched politicians squirm when asked inconvenient questions about their relationships with inconvenient people. They watched, for the first time, the actual texture of the world they had been reading about for years. And then they watched Meyer Lansky. He did not sweat. He did not squirm. He sat before the committee with the same quality of stillness he had carried since he was a teenager watching dice games on the Lower East Side, the stillness of someone who has already calculated every possible outcome of the situation and found all of them manageable. He answered questions carefully, precisely, and with a brevity that frustrated investigators who had hoped that the pressure of a nationally televised Senate hearing might produce something useful. It did not produce something useful. It produced, instead, a demonstration of exactly why Meyer Lansky had never been successfully prosecuted for anything significant and why, despite 4 decades of federal attention, he would never be. The Kefauver Committee had been doing something genuinely unprecedented. In the years immediately following World War II, American law enforcement's understanding of organized crime was, by modern standards, remarkably fragmented. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had been publicly skeptical for years about the very existence of a national crime syndicate, a skepticism that served various purposes, not all of them innocent, and that had left a significant gap in federal understanding of how the organizations actually worked. Kefauver was attempting to fill that gap through public hearings, sworn testimony, the presence of cameras and reporters, and an audience of millions who were suddenly, unexpectedly, paying attention. His committee had gathered testimony from police chiefs, prosecutors, former bootleggers, casino operators, and a rotating cast of figures connected to organized crime across the country. The picture that emerged was, for the first time, a national one. Not a series of local operations, but a coordinated network with national reach, national relationships, and national financial implications. The committee understood that Meyer Lansky was central to that network. They understood that he occupied a role in the financial architecture of American organized crime unlike any other figure they had examined. Not a boss, not an enforcer, not a local operator. Something harder to define, and for that reason, considerably harder to reach legally. What the committee did not fully understand was that the difficulty of reaching him was itself a product of the system he had built. Every question they asked him about specific financial transactions led, with remarkable consistency, to a wall. He didn't recall the details, he wasn't personally involved, the corporate entity they were asking about was not controlled by him in any way he was in a position to confirm. The account they had identified was not connected to him through any documentation he was able to produce. The answers were not provably lies, which in legal terms amounts to the same thing as truth. They were the visible surface of a structure designed to have no provable surface. Senator Kefauver found Lansky to be the most frustrating witness of the entire investigation, not the most dramatic. There were witnesses who were more theatrical, more defiant, more cinematically hostile, but the most frustrating because the hostility was invisible. Lansky was polite. He was cooperative in manner, if not in substance. He expressed respect for the committee and its important work. He simply had nothing useful to tell them, and he communicated this with an equanimity so complete that it was impossible to characterize as obstruction. The television audience watching in their living rooms saw the gap between what the questions implied and what the answers contained. Kefauver's questions implied a man at the center of an enormous criminal enterprise, a financial architect whose decisions affected organized crime operations from New York to Miami to Las Vegas to Havana. Lansky's answers contained a man of modest means with no documented income, no ownership of significant assets, and no verifiable connection to the operations being described. Both things were true simultaneously. That was the achievement. That had always been the achievement. The cameras had a particular hunger for legible narrative, for moments of revelation, for the visible and dramatic. The hearings provided this in abundance from other witnesses. The nervous sweating, the Fifth Amendment invocations, the theatrical defiance of someone who had decided performance was the only available defense. These were moments television could capture and 30 million viewers could understand. Lansky gave the cameras nothing to work with. He answered questions. He did not fidget. He showed no signs of guilt, no signs of nervousness, no body language that television audiences had learned to read as evidence of something being hidden. He looked to 30 million viewers like exactly what he appeared to be, a small, unremarkable, somewhat boring man politely explaining that he didn't have the information the committee was looking for. The Kefauver hearings established a vocabulary for organized crime that had not previously existed in the mainstream. What they missed was the financial layer, the layer that made everything else function. The hearings were accurate in what they described and incomplete in what they missed. The most financially significant figure in the national crime syndicate was not Italian-American. He was Jewish, from the Lower East Side, the son of immigrants from the Pale of Settlement. He had built his role not through violence or ethnic solidarity or territorial claims, but through financial sophistication that operated entirely outside the frameworks the committee was using to make sense of what it was looking at. The Italian-American organizations generated the money. Lansky managed it. The hearings documented the organizations. They could not document the management because the management had been designed from the beginning to leave no documentation that any legal process could compel. There is a specific irony in the relationship between the Kefauver hearings and Meyer-Lansky that becomes more visible with historical distance. The hearings were the moment of maximum scrutiny, maximum public attention, maximum institutional pressure, the full weight of a Senate investigation backed by the attention of 30 million citizens. In that moment, the man who understood the financial system of American organized crime better than anyone else in it sat in front of the cameras and demonstrated, with complete composure, that visibility and accountability were not the same thing. You could see him. You could not reach him. When it was over, he thanked the committee and walked out into the street. He ate breakfast the next morning at the same diner. The FBI surveillance car was in its usual position. The agents inside had watched the hearings on television the night before, like everyone else. Nothing had changed. The system absorbed the pressure and continued. The cameras had rolled for hours. They had captured his face, his voice, his hands on the table, his careful and precise answers to every question asked. They had captured everything about him that was visible. What they had not captured, what no camera ever captured, across all the years of surveillance and investigation and public scrutiny that surrounded his life, was the system. The offshore accounts, the shell corporations, the financial architecture that converted criminal revenue into legal invisibility across multiple countries simultaneously, the thing that actually mattered. The cameras showed America what Meyer-Lansky looked like. They could not show America what he had built. In a hearing designed to make the invisible visible, his greatest achievement was remaining invisible while sitting directly in front of the cameras, not through deception, not through performance. Through a system so well constructed that the most powerful investigative instrument the United States Senate had deployed in a generation could not find a single provable thing to hold against him. Being seen and being known were two very different things. The Kefauver hearings demonstrated this more clearly than any other single event in his life. 30 million people saw him. No one, then or afterward, could prove what they had seen.